Yeah. Yeah. So I think that bait and switch style scams are one of the more common tenancy scams that you see in Vancouver and in the Lower Mainland. And they generally work in the same way. A landlord or a possible landlord will have a listing for a unit. Tenant will be interested, will sign a contract either before seeing the place or without really having a full chance to view it. And then when they come time to move in, they show up and they realize that the unit they're getting is not the one that was advertised to them, or if it is, it's in significantly different condition. So it might have more damage or me missing certain amenities that they were promised. So there's two things tenants can do in those situations. So the first thing is to think about what things you can do to protect yourself ahead of time. The scam mostly targets, I think, people who are moving into a community from outside the community, because it's those people who have the most difficulty getting there to actually view the unit ahead of time. So one way to sort of make sure that you are getting what you're paying for is to either find a way to visit the unit yourself beforehand, or if you can't go, see if you have any friends or family in the area, or if someone's even available to be hired in the area to be your agent to go check it out. Um, and in situations where someone has found themselves caught up in this kind of scam, they still have legal rights and they may be able to seek sort of compensation or legal orders to sort of the landlord to order them to provide them with a different unit if the one they rented is still available. And they can seek that legal compensation, that legal recourse through the residential tenancy branch.
I see. But what about like yeah but yeah, I guess like like physically physically to stop by
Mhm.
the property that you want to rent would be ideal. But I guess that during the crazy COVID time, especially you're living in other province
Mhm.
and you are not you can afford to hire anyone to do that.
Yeah.
So so in that scenario, so is there any alternative way to like like to cut
It's really good.
to yeah to inspect the unit that you want to rent?
Right. Yeah. If it's totally impossible to actually see the unit before you rent it, then I think a tenant could still take some steps to protect themselves. So first, I would generally say that it's not a great idea most of the time to pay a security deposit or begin paying rent before you actually see the unit, because there are some scams that are bait and switch scams where the landlord doesn't have any unit to rent at all and it's a pure fiction and they're just trying to take the money and run. So that's important to at least make sure you're in a place before you begin paying some of that money. Um, in terms of protecting yourself when you can't visit in person, a tenant can still do their sort of due diligence in researching the landlord. So if a landlord is seems like a larger company, you can look up online to see if they have any reviews. Even if a landlord seems to just be an individual, you can do a little bit of Googling to get an idea of whether that person is our landlord, might actually own the property. And finally, if a person knows the actual address of the rental unit that they want to be renting, if they want to make sure that the person who is saying they're renting it to them actually owns it, in British Columbia, you can actually look up in the land title registry who owns any piece of property. So you can get the address, you can search it up on what's called the myltsa.ca, and you can identify who the owner, the actual owner of the property is. And that can help to sort of make sure you're not accidentally signing a tenancy agreement for a property with someone who doesn't actually own that property.
I see. What about like oh, so like I guess like this kind of scam is usually target someone like some newcomers, right?
Mhm. Yes, a lot of the time, people who fall victim to these scams are people who are moving to BC for the first time or are coming to BC for the first time, such as international students. Yeah.
Oh, I see. Oh, what about like what about if the okay so if the tenant they have been asked to sign they have been asked to sign the lease or pay the deposit like before their arrival. What about they have been asked to do that, so they have no option to.
Yeah, that's tough. I think a lot of the times in any tenancy agreement, you're going to have to sign and pay a deposit before you can move in. So there's always going to be some element of faith, of trust between the parties. I think that where a tenant signs a tenancy agreement, if they don't get what they were promised, they can still seek legal recourse against the landlord. And sort of to protect yourself in that regard, a tenant should think about when they sort of contact a landlord and accept to enter into a tenancy, it's a good idea to sort of save the listing that the tenant saw that includes all the details about the unit, that includes pictures, so that if a tenant later has to go before the residential tenancy branch and say, you know, I paid for, this is what I thought I was getting, and this is what I got, and I'd like some compensation to make up the difference, that they have some evidence of, you know, what they thought they were getting in the listing.
What about for the tenant, like for those tenants like who realize they have been scammed, so
Mhm.
who should they reach out to?
Right. So I think tenants who think they've been scammed, they can should reach out first for sort of legal information about their situation. So here at the Tenant Resource and Advisory Center, we provide legal information on our website at tenants.bc.ca, and we also run a tenant information line that we answer tenants' questions. Tenants can also reach out to the residential tenancy branch. They offer some information on their own information line, and there are also lots of tenancy advocates around British Columbia that tenants can contact and ask to see if they can get some level of assistance with their matter. At the end of the day, if a tenant wants to take legal steps to get compensation, to get recourse, they have to go through the residential tenancy branch and make an application to them for what's called dispute resolution, which is kind of like tenancy court.
Uh, I I actually heard that some landlord or maybe some scammer, they actually play around, is it um the um the tra is it the travel, like the travel agreement, to try to
Mm,
avoid the legal responsibility. So can you just talk a
right.
little bit about that?
For sure. Yeah, I think landlords. How to put this? Let me just think about how to put this carefully. Um, So the Residential Tenancy Act provides certain rights and responsibilities for tenants in British Columbia. And the act always applies based on whether or not it's a tenancy that's covered under the act. So it sets out the rules for when the rules apply. And it also says specifically that a landlord and tenant can't agree to ignore those rules. Some landlords will put in their written agreements with tenants terms that suggest that or purport to say that this agreement is some other kind of accommodation, such as a travel accommodation or a short-term living accommodation. The, the problem for landlords who try that is that the law is not on their side. If a tenant brings a claim to the residential tenancy branch and the landlord says, actually, this is travel accommodation, so it's not covered, the tenant doesn't have these rights, the tenant can argue back the correct interpretation of the law, which is that the act applies whether or not we look at the actual living situation. So generally, if you're a tenant and you're renting a suite and you're using it as your primary accommodation, the RTA is likely to apply. So you're likely to have your full suite of tenancy rights. Even in situations where the RTA doesn't apply, tenants might still have legal recourse. It might just be a little bit more complex and challenging to figure out exactly what way to get it. So yeah, no one should think that. I think in almost all situations with bait and scam, or sorry, in almost all situations where a tenant has fallen into a bait and switch scam, they likely have some form of legal recourse. They just might need some help figuring out exactly what it is and how to use it.
Oh, okay, and also when they sign the lease, they should be looking through all the terms and conditions like carefully. So
Yes.
just in case there's some kind of content that is really hidden.
Yes, it's always very important to read through any legal document before you sign it, because it's generally you should assume that any term in a contract you sign, you're going to be held to it. You're going to be obligated to follow it. That being said, if in a tenancy agreement, a landlord has put in a term that is contrary to the Residential Tenancy Act, then that term might not be enforceable, and a tenant has the right to challenge it with the residential tenancy branch and say, I want them to tell the landlord that this is actually not enforceable and I don't have to follow it. But it's generally safer to assume that you're going to have to follow all of those terms. And even if you're reading through a tenancy agreement, it's also important to get an idea also of who the landlord is. What are the kind of terms that they're including? If a landlord is saying, we think this is short-term travel accommodation and we're not going to respect any of your rights under the act, that might be a sign to tenants that maybe this landlord isn't the best person to be dealing with for a long-term tenancy. But obviously, in a zero vacancy market like Vancouver and much of British Columbia, it's very challenging to find any place to live. So even if a tenant does enter into that kind of agreement, illegal terms are still illegal.
I see. What about like so so when it when it comes to the deposit, some land some landlord, they may refuse to return the deposit.
Mhm.
So is there any way that that the tenants can to kind of like to guarantee to get their deposit back?
Right. Unfortunately, I think with the system we have for security deposits, it's hard for a tenant to absolutely guarantee that they can get their deposit back. That being said, if a landlord doesn't follow the rules for the return of a deposit, a tenant can apply for a monetary claim against the landlord for double the value of the deposit. It's a relatively straightforward process, and the residential tenancy branch actually has a special expedited hearings system for those kinds of claims. And if a tenant is successful, they get a monetary order that they can enforce against the landlord in provincial court to try and recover the money. There are, I think, some challenges for that with tenants who aren't familiar with that enforcement system. If a landlord doesn't sort of agree to their demand to pay it back initially, it might take some more work and a bit more effort from a tenant to get it back from a landlord. But ideally, it should be possible. It's just hard to say in every case exactly how much work it's going to take. It is, I think, a systemic problem with security deposit withholding. There are some sort of bad faith landlords that sort of take the position that they're just going to hold on to all of their deposits and only give them back once they're forced to by a court, just playing a sort of numbers game, assuming that tenants on average, not all of them are going to want to go through the time and effort it takes to get their deposit back. So I think that's a systemic problem that, we certainly at the Tenant Resource and Advisory Center are thinking of in terms of when we advocate to government. And I think it's an issue that has been flagged by the residential tenancy branch and by government. So people are working, I think, on strategies for solving it. But at the current moment, it's not a guarantee to get it back at the end of the day. But there's lots of tools that you can use to try and get it back.